The more interesting stuff that I did is on tail call, actually, with the execution spec snapshot testing framework, which was really cool. I think this is one of my coolest projects. Basically, they had like two sort of test suites. They had a GraphQL spec, which was kind of like 4 test types in itself, of like you could provide a server file and make sure that it errors and that the error message is valid. You could provide a server file and make sure that it builds and that the client schema is correct. You could also provide a server file and run a GraphQL query on it, not even like end to end, but just like on the GraphQL part. You could also test merging multiple GraphQL server SDLs to test that behavior. And they also had a different thing called HTTP spec, and that was the end-to-end thing where you could define a GraphQL config, and then you had the mock endpoints and assertions. So the config would target the mock endpoint to get the data, and then the assertion would query the server to make sure that the config actually works. There were at least 2 types of files in like different places, which was pretty messy. They wanted someone to create an execution spec that combined all these and would actually merge HTTP spec and GraphQL spec. And they basically wanted it to be written in Markdown. So you can write config, here's your config, assert, here's your assert, and then the assert will target the config. This is pretty cool, and I jumped on this ASAP. Yeah, I was asked to use the Insta Snapshot framework, which is something really cool. Yeah, so here we have Insta Snapshot. So it's a sort of like a snapshot testing framework where you don't actually write assertions. You create snapshots of your output that you would normally assert. And then if the snapshot is different from the last snapshot that was created, it fails. And then if it was expected to fail because your output changed, then you can just quickly accept the new snapshot. Or if it fails because the output is wrong and your code is wrong, then you can fix your code. You don't really have to rewrite a lot of tests when you change something that actually should be changed. You can just auto accept the snapshot, which is great. Getting this to work was a bit difficult just because of the sort of messy stuff in Rust testing and just like Rust serialization in general. I think at some point I had to like enable a weird feature flag on Serta.json to retain the order of JSON keys so that the snapshot wouldn't just like dance around and fail. One of the requirements was also to write a test converter and actually be able to automatically convert every single pre-existing test to use the execution spec format. So we have execution spec right here. This is what's used to parse the Markdown spec and actually perform it. I based this off of the pre-existing like HTTP spec and GraphQL spec, which doesn't actually exist anymore. But yeah, I was basically able to use that to create my own spec. So this is what I was talking about. You can test, you can make sure that it errors out to say, okay, SDL error. So this is expected to error out. And then you define the server that's just wrong. So if we take a look at test no base URL snap, you can see that this was the error that was outputted by this. And that's what's verified again on every test run. There's also a bunch of this, like sometimes you needed to explicitly define that you wanted to perform like a merge check. You usually needed to create a normal test of like an HTTP spec test that actually tests what you are doing. And then you also needed to create a merge test because you changed the merge stuff. I don't know, you added a config parameter or something, and then you should have created a test for that. Sometimes that wasn't done and sometimes stuff failed. Now I added that everything is automatically merge tested so that you don't need to declare that explicitly. It's automatically done for everything, which increases the coverage a considerable amount. So let's see test.js hello world. So you have a server block right here, which describes your GraphQL server. And then you have an assertion block that actually runs the request. So as you can see, there's no like expected response here, because if you do test.js hello world md assert 0.snap, then you can see that this is the expected response. It was automatically generated by a known good build. And then if you break something, it detects that the actual data does not match the snapshot, and then it fails. And you can actually do stuff like link JavaScript to it, so you can like script some stuff. So for that, I also added a mock file system, so you can just define files. So you can say, okay, file test.js, and then your file is here. And if you say, okay, open test.js, then the mock file IO that I created reads this. Really just the point was to be able to centralize everything into one file that is needed for one test case. One thing that's also done is if you have a server block anywhere, it also automatically generates a client. So all those GraphQL specs that check the client generation are now also obsolete and are automatically done for everything and even more cases that were done before. So you can say execution spec test.js hello world client, and here's the client that was generated. So this is pretty straightforward. The magic actually happened in test.conf, which automatically converted everything to the new format. So what it does is it opens the old tests, reads everything from them, and sort of tries to parse them. So for example, the HTTP specs were in YAML, so it emits Markdown that can be put straight into the new execution spec file. And there were some stuff in the original format, like fail annotations, saying that, okay, this is expected to fail, that we couldn't actually support in the new version, because Insta doesn't like let you expect a snapshot to fail, because that's kind of dumb. If you expect it to fail, then just save the failing snapshot, is the philosophy there. What we do is exactly that. So if we detect that there's a fail annotation, we actually run the test suite and save the failing snapshot. And this is repeated for everything else. There's all sort of edge cases that need to be handled, which took most of the time when building this test.conf, and it automatically runs prettier because you want your execution spec to be formatted. The test.conf was the most complicated thing. In this execution spec, it was pretty easy because I used a Markdown parser that created an ast tree that I could just walk and get everything and turn it into a Rust like struct. This was really just a super interesting thing to tackle, which really helped me because I could use this fun project to keep my motivation up while also doing stuff that was a little bit hard or inconvenient or demotivating. So you should always just like have a bounty going in the background that is actually like really interesting to you, even if it's not like really high reward maybe, especially if you're doing like a lot of other bounties that feel like scut work. It can really help a lot to be doing a bounty at the same time that you can just go back to and work away at it if you just need a break or need to do something else.